ფესტივალის მეორე დღეს, მადლობა რომ გვეწვიეთ ფესტივალის უკვე მეორე დღეს. დღევანდელ დღეს ხსნით დისკუსიით ჩვენი ფესტივალის მთავარი თემის სახლის შესახებ და ჩვენი არაჩვეულებრივი მწერლები ირლანდიიდან, უკრაინიდან და ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატებიდან ისაუბრებენ სახლის კონცეფციაზე, მათეულ გაგებაზე, ამ ტერმინისა, ამ თემის და ლიტერატურაში სახლის თემატიკაზე. ხათუნა ცხადაძე იქნება ჩვენი დღევანდელი საღამოს მოდერატორი. ინგლისურად იქნება დისკუსია და თუ თარგმანი გჭირდებათ, ყურსასმენები აიღეთ უკანდევს. დიდი მადლობა ხათუნა.
Madloba Nuka. Thank you. Hello everyone, I'm Khatuna Tzkhadadze. I'm going to moderate today's meeting, and I am pleased, delighted to present our wonderful guest this evening, Andrei Lubka, a poet, novelist, and essayist from Ukraine, Uzhgorod. Andrei is author of several collections of poems, short stories, and essays, and 3 novels. His works are translated in English, Polish, German languages. Overall, his works are published in more than 10 countries. Welcome, Andrei. Jessica Traynor is an award-winning author from Dublin, Ireland. She's author of different collections. She's the winner of Listowel Poetry Prize in 2011 and recipient of the Ireland Chair of Poetry Bursary in 2014. Her works has been commissioned by the Arts Council, Poetry Ireland, and the Salvage Press. Jessica has worked as literary manager for the Abbey Theatre as deputy director of Irish Immigration Museum. And our third guest is Nilufar Talebi, author, award-winning translator, multidisciplinary artist, and producer. Nilufar's works have been commissioned and presented at Carnegie Hall, Stanford Live, the Kennedy Center, and the Los Angeles Country Museum of Art. Nilufar Talebi is the recipient of prizes and fellowships, including from Pan America, the International Center for Writing and Translation, the California Arts Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Creative Work Fund. Mrs. Talebi is a 2021-2022 Fulbright U.S. Scholar to Georgia, where she came to write a historical novel and started writing a non-fiction work about home. So, welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and to talk about the topic, which is very important, I guess, for all of us. And according to the main theme of this year's festival, home, our panel, our discussion today is going to be set in order to talk about home in a broader sense, home as a concept, which can represent and mean many, many things. I wanted to ask first, maybe I'd start from Andrei, if that's okay with you. And then I'm going to ask other panelists also the same question, actually. What does home mean to you, and how it is represented in your own works? And first of all, Andrei, I want to use this opportunity and to wish to your country, to your wonderful people of Ukraine, courage, strength, and victory. We stand with you. We support Ukraine. Thank you.
Didi Magloba, thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that yes, we are liberated our homes, and just today we knew wonderful news that Ukrainian army liberated 2 new towns at the Eastern Front near Kharkiv. It is Kupiansk, and as Russian telegram channels informed us, even Izum is liberated by Ukrainian army. So it is a huge success. We thought that it would be possible in October. British intelligence yesterday told that, okay, liberation of Kupiansk is possible in few nearest days, but it was made in one night, and it is a miracle for us. I'm very happy. Yeah, I'm really very happy today. And maybe it is about a home. It is about when you fight for your home because you feel your land and your property and home from walls and stones, as something very important for you. I have to say that I think that the concept of home differs and changes during your life. When you are a child, home is very important for you because home is, it is symbol of safety. And after that, with years, it is very important to leave your home. So as far as I remember when I was a student, for me it was really important step to leave my home and to be homeless, because it means freedom. It means that at that time I started to be adult, independent person, and at that time I have no home. Now, when I have my own family, when I have a daughter, and now I can reconsider my connections and links with home and with my family and with my mother, I understand only now, that it is very important to have home, even if it is far away, even if you don't live in it. And in Ukraine, when the war started, it was very visible in natural way, because a lot of young people who live in Kyiv, who started to create their new career in capital and rent a house and so on, when the war started, they returned to their villages, to their families, and it was the most safe place in the world for them. Even if they don't have internet, or I don't know, or some modern furniture there, but it was very important. And I think that we have these different ages in our life when, first of all, we have to leave our home, but after that, you have to build your own home, to create this home, this place for other people. And for me, as for poet, it is quite strange, because probably for the human beings, it is most important to be free, to have these feelings of freedom, yeah. And for example, now in some climates, probably in Georgia, you can live on the street, somewhere in the nature, in the forest or in the field and so on. But in fact, we feel safety only in a cage, because home is also a cage, but a cage in which you enforce your own laws. The cage in which you create everything and build everything how you want. Yeah. So of course you, in a way, shortened your freedom with these walls, but you like it because it is your walls. Yeah, and it is world which is ordered and governed by you. And for us writers who travel a lot, who use these residencies for writers and so on, it is really easy to switch homes. And when I come to some another country for a few months and met some people in some cities and so on, after we have some wine, I say, okay, I'm going home, yeah, to this residency house in which I live only for one month. But what is different? What this war added, opened a new sense about the concept of the home, that home is not the place you own, is not the place of your safety, but home, which is probably the most important thing, is the place to which you can invite another person. Because when you are a guest, you cannot invite someone. When you are a refugee and live in another house, when you are a guest, writer in residence, so on, you cannot invite another person. But home is a place where can you share this safety with others. And it is very important for us. And I saw I live in Western Ukraine, so we saw this huge wave of refugees from Eastern Ukraine when the war started, and it was really terrific at that time. But I saw that people who in few minutes packed their backpacks, in order to flee, I saw what they actually put in the backpacks, and it was really, really stupid things. They didn't take something which can help them to survive, some important things and so on, some winter clothes. It was February. Yeah? They put very strange, stupid things like, a lot of my friends, probably it is my circle, but okay, a lot of my friends took one book with them, because for them it is sign of this coziness of their home. It is sign that they not lose their dignity as animals who are fleeing from, earthquake. Yeah, they took some photographies, and in this digital era, it is very strange when someone, have this real photography and they took it. They took some family albums with old photographers of elder generations. And of course you cannot use it when you are a refugee, yeah? But probably it is the most important for you. It is the essence of your link to another people with whom you share this feeling of safety. And you cannot take your home with you. You cannot, I am sure that you cannot rebuild as a refugee your home somewhere. But I think that you always want to return to your home, and it is endless hope and endless dream. Yeah?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. I think you touched on very important points and aspects of this concept: home as a place, as a safe place, as a place we tend to be attached to, and home as people we loved, places we loved and lived in, and stories we're attached to, we're brought up with. And I wanted just to ask also about your work, how home is reflected in your own, how do you think in your own work?
I have different poems dedicated to the place which you can call home. But mostly I think that in the broader sense, I dedicate myself and what I do to describing the essence of my region. So all of my books, in a way, are dedicated to my small region, my small part of Ukraine, because I know it very well, and I feel like my small motherhood, if we can take it like this. And I think that everything is started from every pathetic thing, like motherhood, yeah, starts from the very simple thing and very small things. So you have your own walls, you have your own property as a home, and then you have this small land, you have your own dialect like we have, you have some differences in culture, in cuisine, in mentality, and these differences are very important in this huge mosaic of your country and your big motherhood. And as a writer, I dedicate a lot of time and efforts in order to portray them, in order to make them interesting to another people, not only in Ukraine but in another cultures, and do it in natural way. So I think if I will be a student at some lecture and you will ask me to write an essay about home, the best way for writer is to write about home without any words about home. Yeah, so because you can portray your home when you are going around it and not seeing it, yeah? So you see the surroundings, and then you understand that you are in the circle, and in the center of it could be something which you can, by your using your imagination, create by yourself, and it will be your own home created by the writer. So it's my way of writing.
Thank you very much. My next question would be to Iranian-American guest, Nilofar Talibi, which I guess has a lot to share with us. Basically, I wanted to ask you the same question as Nilofar. What does it mean to you? Which space is home for you? Because we are all people dealing with words and languages, and so it can be language too. But I want just to ask you, what does it mean to you, and how home, the idea of home, is reflected in your work?
Madloba. Hello, everybody. Gamarjoba. I'm so glad that you asked this question. Actually, I was here reading excerpts of the new work that I have been writing since I've been here in Georgia for now almost 6 months because of my fellowship. I originally came here to write a historical novel that I had written in various forms as different works like libretti for opera. And then I realized one day that these short operas were parts of a longer story that was a generational saga. So I came here to write this novel that is partly set in Georgia in the late 19th century and also in the present moment between the great-grandmother of the story and the great-granddaughter of the story. But as I had been doing all the research and immersing myself in Georgian culture and history, a completely different book in addition to the historical novel has come out, which is about home. And the reason why I think this has happened is because I have ancestors who are from Iran, and I have also lived in Iran myself. I was not born there at some points in my childhood. And I've been in the United States for many, many years, and I write and teach in the English language. I also translate from the Persian, which is my mother tongue, into English. But something that I've been noticing for decades is that the question of what is home for you, asked of only immigrants in the United States. If home is such a universal issue, and it's such a universal and abstract and personal and personalized and shifting concept that everybody is experiencing, I had always wondered, why is this question only ever asked of immigrants and refugees and people that were, in a way, not of the land in which they were living or making their homes or second homes. This had always bothered me, and I had actually always tried to avoid being in situations when this question is asked of me where I live in the United States, because I really didn't have the language with which to describe this repulsion to this question asked of me because I am perhaps an immigrant in the United States. So I'm glad when you sent us the questions is what is home for us as artists and not necessarily as citizens, as a civilian. As an individual and a civilian, home for me is something very personal, and it's something that is shifting constantly, minute by minute. And as Andre explained, that as artists, we are generally traveling, we are crossing borders all the time, and really our art is the common denominator between us and humanity. So in a way, that is the locus, that is the location of our home, that interaction between us and our audiences. So I don't really want to talk about home as that sort of fuzzy and warm, place with your grandmother and homemade food and all that. That is a home that is not of interest to me at all. That's a home that we sort of all know, and it's not always warm and fuzzy because a lot of people experience trauma and violence and things of that sort in their homes. So it's not always associated with warmth and fuzz. What I do want to talk about is a sort of a counter narrative to home in relation to immigrants in the empires in which they live. So I think that this notion of home as a political notion has become weaponized of immigrants in order. So I feel like there is an industry of inquisition and interrogation of immigrants and exiles who are very often displaced from their actual original ancestral homes and then deigned to be allowed into the second homes that they occupy, which is generally the countries that are the empires that have sort of caused their displacement to begin with. And so I'd like to offer an idea that home is used as a political platform and as a weapon to keep othering people who have already been displaced and made to, how should I say, their homelessness and their search for a return to stability has been magnified politically. So that is the book that's coming out of me as a result of being in Georgia. I choose not to travel back to Iran. I have not been back to Iran in 38 years since I left as a young girl. And I have chosen not to go back because I lived in Iran after the revolution. And I know I was nearly arrested and raped twice by the Revolutionary Guard as a very young girl when hijab was first being instituted in Iran. And so I understand the randomness of putting oneself in situations of risk in such countries. So I choose not to go to Iran. It's not because I'm not allowed to go or anything else. So there is, as I get older, a certain rage against this survivalship, this decision to extricate myself voluntarily from my ancestral land. I was not born in Iran, but I'm 100% of Iranian genetics, and I lived in Iran, and my parents are from Iran, so in many ways I am Iranian as well as anything else. So there is that rage against not going to Iran voluntarily, but also there is also a rebellion to being put under the microscope and my homelessness in a way being magnified by others. There's a really interesting saying in the Persian language called "Nemishe besh goft bala cheshmesh abrust," which means you can't tell someone that they have an eyebrow over their eye, meaning like you can't tell them the obvious. That obvious is owned by them, and they should be the ones declaring it. So for me, home as a political thing is the story that I will tell in my own way, in my own time. Home for me is a space that I make to be quiet and to create work. Those are the things that are homes for me, and we could go on ad nauseum about what home is. It shifts all the time. But I invite everybody, so the book that I'm writing is triggered by being in Georgia, a third place against not being able to go to Iran and against how home is foisted upon me as a political notion in the country in which I live. And I'm very excited because it's nonfiction, and I'm writing it in a place where I'm at home, which is a non-categorizable sort of non-fiction / fiction / poetry / translation. So that is a short answer to what I think about home.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'll be back to language, actually. That's something which I'm very interested in. So, Jessica, what's that for you? The notion, your work about it. And also, I'm sure you have something to share with us because you have this wonderful, I guess, experience of working with Immigration Museum. So I'm pretty sure that it shaped your experience in a specific manner.
Yes, and again, like everybody said, it's so lovely to be here. It's my first time visiting Georgia, and we've just had a wonderful day experiencing Tbilisi and the history, and it's made me think a lot actually about Irish history and the parallels between Irish and Georgian history, particularly in things like our struggle for independence. You know, we are in Ireland a post-colonial country. We had 800 years of colonial rule. We've recently celebrated 100 years of independence. And that has been a really fascinating process of coming to know ourselves as a country and coming to know and recognize, I suppose, the traumas around the idea of home that we've been left with, the legacy of that trauma of colonisation. And Irish people have a very complex relationship to home. We have a huge diaspora around the world of, I think, over 40 million people. You know, the population of Ireland is quite tiny in comparison to that. And we have an obsession, this national obsession, and anxiety around home and home ownership. We come from a country during the 19th century where absentee landlords, mostly English ascendancy, absentee landlords owned huge swathes of the countryside and rented tiny parcels of land to tenants who then could only farm enough subsistence crops to just about support their own families. And of course this led to the Great Famine in the 19th century and the practice of also exporting grain and other foods from the country while 1 million Irish people starved. There was a population of 8 million. 1 million starved or died of fevers and other related famine diseases, and another million emigrated. And the population of Ireland continued to fall until, I think, probably the early 2000s. So I think at its lowest population, there were only around 2 million, maybe in the middle of the 20th century, people living in Ireland. The population has increased since then. Our society is modernised hugely quickly. I was talking about that with some of my colleagues from the Writers' Festival earlier. But we remain a society that's incredibly anxiety-ridden about home ownership, about where we call home, about our access to home. Most other European countries, people rent. They rent their houses, they rent apartments. This goes on for generations. In Ireland, everybody wants to own their home. And it led to a big property bubble just before the last recession. We had a huge property crash, much like they did in the US. But I've always been interested in how these things reflect our kind of national psyche in a way. And how they make us relate then to people who want to come and live in our country. Ireland as a country has been shaped, as I said, by emigration up until very recent times. But from the mid-90s onwards, we did start to see, and I don't even want to call them waves of immigration because I actually hate that term. I think it's a kind of a pejorative term. It suggests being overwhelmed. It suggests being immersed. I think it has negative connotations. We started to have immigrants come from other countries to live in Ireland. Firstly, mostly from the Chinese and the Korean communities. That was our first wave of immigration. Then we had numbers of people from Poland and other Eastern European countries. And I think the Polish society is still one of the biggest groups of immigrants living in Ireland. But when the recession hit us, a lot of those immigrants went home. They didn't stay. And we also experienced another wave of Irish immigration. So when the recession hit, I had just left university, and most of my generation left Ireland, and very few of them have come back. So emigration has always been a pressure release valve in Ireland, and it was a social policy right through the 20th century. Rather than saying, let's look at employment programs, let's look at these kind of things, it was, well, they just get on the boat and go. So people's response in Ireland to the idea of home is anxious. There's a sense that we may not be able to stay. There's a sense that even though we fought for and regained our country, it's still not necessarily a safe place in which we can plan our futures. Now, you would think that this experience would make us very sensitive to the experiences of refugees and immigrants. It hasn't necessarily. We practice the same hypocrisies as many other nations do in terms of the way that we receive people who have come from places, whether they be people who are coming for a better life to escape social oppression and injustice in many countries, or whether they are escaping war. I have been very proud about how Irish society has responded to the war in Ukraine in terms of welcoming many thousands of Ukrainian people, but we have to contrast that with the way that we have welcomed people from various African countries, people from various Middle Eastern countries, where it is, and this is something that our politicians have said out loud, well, they're not like us. So there is a difference there in perception, and it's something that I think in Irish society we have to be very careful about, because I think we have this idea and sense that history teaches us empathy as societies, and it can and it does, but that empathy can be very quickly lost. So, to get back to the initial question about what home is, it's something that needs to be, I suppose, reassessed all of the time through various generations, the definition of what our home is and what we see it is, and whether that definition is something that's placing boundaries, that's putting up walls to keep people out, or whether it's something that's allowing for a more porous experience, more exchange of cultures. In the museum that I worked in, one of the things that we celebrated was this notion of how the interaction between Irish and other cultures has created wonderful different cultural and artistic expressions all over the world, from things like Irish dancing, informing tap dancing, Irish music informing bluegrass, so many other cultural exchanges we could talk about. How many people with Irish heritage living in other countries have contributed to scientific discoveries? It would be very easy to look at that as a little pinhole camera and say, oh, aren't the Irish great? Haven't we done things that are wonderful? Haven't we punched above our weight as this tiny, plucky little country against the world? But really what I like to see it of is just one tiny example of how movement of people is a constant. It's a constant. It's not something that comes in waves. It's something that is part of humanity, is moving from one place to the other. And the cultural exchange that follows from that is what allows us to create forward leaps in science, in music, in the arts. So when I'm working with people talking about concepts of home, I would generally find myself working with Irish people and trying to give them a sense of the experiences that have been shared with me by various different immigrants to Ireland. I work with a lot of school children, and I was so interested to hear what you said about the backpack and what people put in it, because one of the little exercises I do with young children, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, is to say, if you had to leave your house tomorrow, what would you put in a backpack? And it's a kind of a sweet exercise, but what they come up with is ridiculous in the loveliest way, and in the way that I think captures the kind of the tenderness of the human spirit, in that, at our deep heart's core, we're not pragmatists. We are not conditioned to prepare for conflict, for war, but we are conditioned to bring with us the things that we really love, and those things, as you say, those are home, no matter where you bring them.
Thank you very much. My next question is about language. We have, it's so interesting that we have authors. Well, Andrei writes in Ukrainian, Jessica in English, and I guess our Iranian-American guest is bilingual. She actually made available the most iconic Iranian poets in English language, and that's something of her activity which I loved, and I want to inquire more later. But when I mean language, I wanted to speak about how language represents or embodies, I don't know what's the right word to use, encapsulates our identity as authors and as works too, because, author's identity is not necessarily the identity of our works, so your works. And we Georgians say about our, the greatest authors, oh, it's such a pity that he or she cannot be heard, by the larger audience, because it's such a waste in a way, it's such a limitation, because when you come from a limited or relatively limited linguistic space, that's what happens. And I read Andrei's poem, which is published in the catalog, by the way, which I loved, and which is called How Do I Write, I guess. And I found it so familiar to many Georgians because it's about the language and the feeling of being heard by many people. And I don't know if we have time to read it, but anyway, I wanted to ask you about the language. How much do you believe language is a marker of your identity? How much your language is connected to your identity?
Thank you. I think that yesterday I read this poem, How Do I Write? And it is about Cyrillic alphabet and Ukrainian language. And I recall from my student age when I was a young poet and started to write something, I thought that I make a big struggle against the traditional Ukrainian literature and so on. I was hoping that I will write some American poetry in Ukrainian language, because I was big fan of Beat Generation, of Ginsberg and Kenneth Koch and all of them, Charles Bukowski and so on and so on. And I really wanted to write something like this in Ukrainian language. At that time I studied at a provincial university, which was very patriarchic in a way, and it looks like a real struggle. And I understood that probably it is impossible to write good poem about whiskey in Ukrainian language, because when you write in Ukrainian, you cannot write about some kind like big megapolis like New York. You always, what you write, you pretend to write about whiskey, but you always receive in result this Ukrainian village horilka, something more familiar with vodka, for example, than with whiskey. Yeah? That you have these natural boundaries of your language and of its stylistic possibilities. And that is why I think that, of course, for example, translation is a very good way of working with languages, but as also a translator from Serbian and Croatian to Ukrainian, I understand that usually it is impossible to translate very sensitive things. For example,
Culture, you mean?
Culture, for example, humor, if you want to put a note when you translate something and you put a note, it is your failure as a translator, yeah? And it is impossible from time to time to translate some archetype from folk song or everything which is very well known in the original culture, and it is not so well known in your country. But I have to say that returning to the war, so from time to time Putin and Lavrov and others, these so-called humans, say that they defend Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. And most, I think 99%, 95 maybe, but most of the Russian-speaking people of Ukraine are against Putin, are against Russia. I think that it is very important to put this border between language and the empire. So when our Irish colleague speaks English, it doesn't mean that, she is English writer. And now we see it in Ukraine. A lot of Russian speakers fight, and the battlefield with Russians, because they don't want Russia to come to Ukraine and occupy our territories and protect them and defend them. Yeah, it is very important. And as a poet, I have to say that for me, if we speak about the philosophy of the language, it is something like Ukrainian language or English language doesn't exist, because we have these norms of the language. Yeah, so which were formulated, which were calibrated by some books, writers, academies, and so on. But if you are a good poet, you always you have your own language, with your own words, with own senses, nuances in this senses, with probably not so well-known words, dialects, and so on and so on. So you create your own language, and it is not some, it is not something like narcissistic, egoistic point of view, because not only poets have their own language. Every person has its own language, its own style, its own favorite words, jokes, idiomas. And for example, when we fall in love with someone, we create our own language, yeah, with our codes, with our secret phrases and so on, which only we two of us understand. Yeah, every friendship is also connected with, sealed with some secret words which only we understand, and if I use this word, we will laugh in a minute because we recall one situation. So language is very private. Language is freedom for you. It is not something political, something imperial. And that is why our duty as a poets is to defend your own language, is to defend its also mistakes of the language, yeah? Because a lot of professors at the university says, okay, it is mistake, but if you are a poet, you can do mistake, because language is a free organism. It is, something very alive, very fresh. And why we like language, why we as a poets and other speakers, why we are instruments of the language, because you can form it, you can create it. Language creates you, and you create language. So it is this mutual process, mutual love, in a way, and I think that it is far more important than political point of view. Yes. Yeah.
Did you ever try to write not in Ukrainian, in another language? It's just a curiosity.
No, but I see that, for example, it is impossible, even if I'm quite, for example, probably the language which I knew quite good is a Polish language, because I studied there at the university and spent a few years there. But for me, it is impossible even to translate my text, not a poem, but my column, for example, or some article into Polish, because I think that it would be much more poor than in the original. And I think that this translation, even if it is only work, not translation of the poetry, but even when you translate the article, it is co-creation in the other material, in the other language. So I don't write in other languages and try to create other texts from other languages in Ukrainian language.
Thank you. I was wondering how it sounded a truly American poem about Jaja or something like that. That's an idea. Okay, Jaja is our grandpa. I don't know. So, okay, thank you, Andrew. I wanted to ask Nilufar now about something about language and linguistic identity. And also, there are cases in literature when the authors change the languages they write in. It can be a choice or it can be by necessity, but those are very, very interesting cases, and there are some of the greatest names, from Nabokov to Beckett, and there are many Italians there. Antonio Tabucchi, who is a wonderful Italian writer, he died sadly. He moved to Portugal and started to write also in Portuguese language. He used to be a translator before from Portuguese, and then his last works are in Portuguese language. And when he was asked about, he chose to leave Italy for political reasons, in 90s, which was understandable. And he was asked about his homeland and about his identity, and his answer is very touching and lovely. He said, "My homeland is my beautiful Italian, which I bring with me all the time." So, but I repeat, he had a lot of works written in Portuguese. So this switching, which occurs, Kundera is another very great name, example of that phenomenon. So I was wondering, where is the identity, linguistically speaking?
So much to say about that. Well, I was born in London, so I've been speaking English since I was born. But my mother tongue is Persian because my mother is Persian, and that's the language at home that I grew up with. I'm also a translator, which is something that I discovered by accident because of somebody just pushing me to translate some poems with her. And then once I conceded and started to translate from the Persian into English, my life changed in 2003, and it yielded the first book, which is an anthology of contemporary Iranian poetry created by poets who left Iran after the 1979 revolution and were still reciting in the Persian language, even if they were of the older generations, which would make sense, but also all the way down to the younger generations who were still reciting in the Persian language amidst of living in other languages. So once I discovered this, I realized that, of course, I had been translating in many ways, in metaphorical ways and literal ways, my entire life, translating not only from one language to the other, but from generation to generation, as an immigrant to my parents, as a person who's growing in a different culture. And so this became sort of the glue for me to center my sort of divided selves, yeah, if you will. So translation for me was a really big turning point in my life, and I continue to do it, and it's the greatest pleasure of my life. I've translated over 35 poets and probably published over 28 of them, including the iconic Iranian poet Ahmad Shamlou, who died in the year 2000, who was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 1984 while he was staying at our house in Tehran between 1980 and 1984, when my parents' secret literary salons were happening in Tehran, and he was a frequent visitor and he stayed at our house. And now I'm his translator. But as to my own language home, well, I speak fluently 2, maybe 3 or 4 languages. So I write mainly in English, but I very much include in my texts words from other languages, including Persian, French, German, and Latin. In fact, I have a Latin scholar who works at Berkeley who makes up Latin terms for me, because I want to make, sometimes it just feels right to say something in Latin. As to the notion of, my father was a surgeon, and when he retired, he started to write for himself. And he's a very, very active poet, and he writes in both English and Persian. But a lot of times he sends me his poems, and I edit them for grammatical structure and correctness. And recently, you know, he's 87, and recently he's told me something that was it just encapsulates how we feel about language. He sent me something, and I said, you know, the title, you know, he's making his own book, it's bilingual, he's drawing the cover, it's just a whole creative output. And I said, perhaps the title could be rephrased this way. And he said, why? I said, because it would be more grammatically correct in English. And he wrote me a text saying, not my problem. I'm like, I'm so glad I am your daughter, because that's how I feel about language as well. I mean, if I were to define my language home, it is only when I am creating something new in language. I don't see any point in writing if the writer is not reinventing the language constantly. Especially, not only because that's what we should be doing, because words are our instruments, but also because language is also weaponized for us. All the propaganda that's handed down to us, all the sort of cultural thoughts that are handed down to us by clandestine, secret, right-wing think tanks that makes society think they have language for even liberal movements. All of those phrases and rhetoric and thoughts and ideas are handed down as a way to control our minds. So for me, a linguistic home is when I'm not only creating new and interesting words and language for myself in my writing, but also breaking down this given rhetoric to me that is designed to control my thoughts and take away my freedom. So I see my position as a writer in terms of language in that, to always recreate language, to really describe what it is that we are in this day and age feeling. and how we should be claiming our own individuality and agencies. And a note to your note, Andre, about translation and the failure of the translator when there is a footnote. I am of the opposite mind. Of course, I believe in translation as a way to really migrate the original, really as a beautiful, self-contained, perfect gift to the new reader in the new language, in the target language. And at the same time, I feel like the reader deserves to know the notions of the original culture and have some delicious fruits and foods in the form of footnotes and paratexts and illustrations and links and resources that they can enrich themselves with. So I am very much a proponent for interesting and meaningful footnotes. Because translation, if in reality, you talked about Robert Frost saying, poetry is what's lost in translation. Well, that's an old thought. Nobody thinks that way anymore. What I think is that translation, you start with 100% loss. You're killing something and you're building something else. And your job as a translator is to keep building and building and building in the spirit of the original, innovation, everything, form, playing with language, efficiency of language, magic of language, building up to 100%. It's of course not exactly the same product, but it should be equally as interesting and exciting product, 100%, maybe even exceeding 100% sometimes. So that's how I feel about translation.
Thank you very much. And to ask Jessica too about the language, well, Irish is in reality I have such a poor knowledge about, so I'm really, that's my, but what do you think about linguistical identity, and what about you? And also it's interesting, I mean, the people, like we have a lot of writers who were born with other languages, I mean Pakistan or Afghanistan or some African brilliant writers, but then they, at a certain point of their life in early ages, or maybe not so, switch to English in order to be heard to the audience. So your experience also, if you have an experience to deal with those people who need to switch the language and somehow abandon their native language, in order to write and be heard and read and by the broader audience. Yeah. But first of all, what's the language and your Irish identity?
Yeah, I think the question of the Irish language is really fascinating. I mean, we lost Irish as a language in the 19th century. It was really widely spoken and post-famine, and due to the introduction of a school system that was English-speaking, which is a fantastic school system. You know, it was one of the few good things that the empire did for us, but it was the nail in the coffin of the Irish language because the children were not allowed to speak Irish in school. And so we now have a society where post-independence Irish is a language of the country, so all of our street signs are in Irish and English, and any of our official government communications have to be in Irish and English, and children learn Irish from the ages of 4 when they start school to 18 when they finish. So most of us have a very good grounding in the Irish language, but interestingly enough, many of us, when we go to second level education, secondary school, and we start doing French and German, we will pick it up much quicker than we will end up with a better command of French and German than we do of the Irish language, even though it's a language we've been learning since we were very young. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is that the system of teaching it is quite antiquated and not very good. Secondly, it's a very, very complex language, and it's nothing like English, and it's nothing like any of the Romance languages. And so thinking and writing in Irish requires a completely different approach in terms of things like syntax and grammar. The structure of sentences is completely different. Now, what this makes for is some very exciting Irish language poetry, actually, because the people who do write in Irish, it is this untamed, impolite, musical, declarative, passionate language that's very hard to wrangle into an English poem. So the divide between those translations is fascinating. My Irish isn't fantastic. I can read Irish, I can understand it, but my spoken Irish is pretty much gone since I left secondary school. But I was working recently with some American students from the University of Iowa's creative writing program. They came to Ireland for a summer school, and we did a little module on Irish poetry, which was fascinating because there are some wonderful contemporary Irish poets working in the Irish language, and some of our best English language poets are translating them at the moment. But you have to take such liberties with an Irish language poem when you translate it. So it becomes this fascinating dance between the poet and the translator. There have been fallings out, there have been rows. Some of the poems that I was showing them, I knew that the writer and the translator were not happy with each other afterwards. So there was a certain amount of interesting drama that came from trying to wrestle this unruly Irish language into this polite English form. And I think that's where the excitement lies. I think for anybody writing and translating are those untranslatable moments that we've all been talking about. That is where the lifeblood of the poem is. And just things like I was able to give the students a very basic literal translation of the poem that they could compare with the final piece. And it was just fascinating to see those three different versions and what liberties had been taken and which poets in the English language had managed to capture the spirit, even if the wording was very different. I don't write in Irish myself, but one of my very good friends, Anne-Marie Corone, is a wonderful English language poet as well, but she grew up in the Donegal Gaeltacht. Now, the Gaeltacht is an Irish-speaking area. There are a couple of them in Ireland, mostly rural areas, and Donegal is the remote northwest of the country and the wildest corner of Ireland still. And Anne-Marie would have grown up speaking Irish until she was 18 and left home. And she's still a fluent Irish speaker, still very much involved in everything to do with keeping the language alive and Irish speaking culture. But I asked her recently, I said, why don't you write in Irish? And she said to me that when she tries to write in Irish, it's the language of her 18-year-old self. So she finds herself back in a home, a linguistic home that she left long ago. Now she still goes home and she still speaks to her family in Irish and all of her neighbours and friends, but she doesn't feel that the self who came to Dublin, who gained a kind of an education, who immersed herself in poetry, she doesn't feel that that self is able to speak in Irish. And it's interesting in terms of the other question you've asked about working with people maybe who've come to Ireland from other countries and want to write in English, and I do work with a number of people in that regard. And it's always a really fascinating project because actually it's often the idiosyncrasies that they're bringing from their own language that give their poetry or their work its voice, and you don't want to translate that out of existence. You want to keep that difference there, because again, I think that's where the spark of the writing exists.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting thought. Andrew mentioned a homeland, home as cage, as prison before. So it can be so painful to escape that cage in a way. And just question is that ever possible somehow, and how much we stay in that cage linguistically, emotionally, and so on. So this phenomenon of leaving, abandoning a language in order to adapt to a new reality is always very interesting, and how much of that old identity of old self is preserved in an individual. I wanted to ask something more about translation. Well, I am a translator, so that's why I can't just let you go without asking this. You all are translated authors, and you translate yourselves, at least Andre and Lefabie translate from from different languages. And what's your feeling when you read your own poems translated in other languages? I guess your work is translated into Portuguese, I guess, or that was my curiosity, how much. Well, you mentioned first words, which are very kind of nice, but very frustrating for any translator, because if we believe that poetry is what just disappears, evaporates, he uses this term, in translation, so what's the job we are doing? So what's our work at all? But I tend to disagree with him, and I still believe in translation. So I wanted to ask you about your feelings when you read. Well, sadly, you are not able to understand Georgian translations. The reading was held yesterday, and so, but believe me, they are wonderful. But other translations in the languages you understand. So how much is gone? How much is evaporated, if we believe in Frost? Andrei?
For me, it is always very hard to authorize the translations because I see differences, and when I know language quite good, it is for me always, I have a passion, not only a desire, but a passion to change everything and to do as I see. But I beat my hand because I think that it is a work of translator, and I want to not only to believe him and trust him, but also to give some honor for his work and for his understanding of my work, because usually it is you receive something else in translation. I remember when I was a child in the primary school, it was probably, I was 8 or 9 years old. I played a role, we have this New Year's Eve, and I played a role of Did Moroz. It is like Santa Claus, yeah? And I went in the big sport hall, I went in these clothes of Did Moroz to the microphone, and I knew by heart all of poems I have to read and recite all quotes and so on. But when I came to the microphone and started to speak, I was really afraid because I heard different voice. It was not my voice. So when you hear your voice for the first time via microphone, you feel that it is someone else. And it is the same with translation. You see that it is something else. It is not your poem. And for example, when Shota yesterday read my poem in Ukrainian, I wrote it like American rap, recitative. And when he read it yesterday, the last poem, it was something between the song and a prayer. Yeah, it was very nice. And what was for me very important and generous from him, from Georgian language, that this translation puts something new, invests something new in the original translation and my understanding of it. So, and I'm very happy when, because usually, yes, we lose a lot in translation, but we also receive a lot.
That's true, yeah. We all translators, I guess, admit that that's a job which implies losses and damages, and our job is to make that loss as little as possible and the damage as little as possible. So probably it's better not to know the language, so you just enjoy the sound of it and kind of you're neutral. What about others? Yes.
How do I feel about reading my work in translation?
When you know the language and you feel it kind of, yeah.
Oh, yes.
What's it feel?
So this is how you should never be my translator. No. Let's just say, okay. So I'll give you one example of how I feel. I'm being translated into Persian. This hybrid memoir, actually biography of that poet that I mentioned, Ahmad Shamlu. It's under the guise of my memoir, but it's actually his biography and translations of his work in there, and a history of literature and his trajectory of his immense career. So this book is being translated into Persian, but I will tell you how. I took years to vet a translator. I got recommendations, hired several translators, got work samples from them of translating other works. And then if I liked those, then I paid them to translate an excerpt of my work, of this book. And then if I liked that, then I ended up choosing, the one that I liked. Okay, so after years of vetting somebody, myself, I chose a translator for this work, and I had been working with her for years before that because she was my publisher in some ways in her literary magazine, and she knew the degree of fussiness and control freakiness that is Nilüfer Talebi. So she was familiar with that, and she signed up for it. So we created a Google Doc, and she has sent me, I don't know, up to 15 or so pages of it. And I speak Persian, of course, and she knows the degree of fussiness, and she sends it to me, and she'll write me on Instagram, just so it's not as official, like not an email, and she'll say, check out the doc, and I'll go, okay, maybe in a week I can do it. So then I check out the doc, I literally go like this. Okay, I can't. And then I'll write her and say, I'll look at it at some point. And this is an extremely capable, totally vetted translator by me. Part of it is because I don't understand the Persian that she writes in. She is much, if I understood and spoke Persian to the degree that she does, I would be translating in both directions, whereas I translate only from the Persian into English, which is my stronger language, okay? So she is stronger in Persian and I'm not. So I know that she's creating exciting language and she's innovating in the way that I've innovated and made up words in English. I know that she's trying for that. But because I don't quite understand her language play, I go through hives and anxiety. So I'm really not the best person for anybody to be a translator of. That said, when I encounter people who, and I've had other works translated into Persian, and I'm always 100% involved in that translation. So it takes a very special person to translate me, and I don't recommend it. So that's how I...
Oh my God. An author a living author who knows your language, the language you translate his or her work in, must be easily the most terrifying person on earth.
But as a translator, I have worked with poets like that, and I like working with poets like that because I recognize the madness.
Oh my God. It's good. I work in Georgian, so nobody can know it. The authors. Jessica, what about you? How do you feel about translation, your translated works?
Yes, well, I have translated a fair few poems from Irish into English, and I always enjoy that. But one of my most recent experiences was having my first collection of poetry translated by some PhD students working in the University of Bahia in Brazil. So they're working in Portuguese, but the kind of Brazilian dialect, of which I know nothing at all. And it was a fascinating and, kind of agonizing process of Zoom calls across 3 time zones and trying to explain things. It was really fascinating, the things that I ended up trying to explain that seemed to be slightly very banal, but weirdly untranslatable concepts. Like, I have one poem that is set in my childhood kitchen, and my mum is cooking dinner, and in the 1980s in Ireland, the windows are bad and there's no insulation, so if you're cooking, the windows are steamed up with condensation, and a lot of the houses have rising damp, and I was trying to explain the concept of condensation, and rising damp, and the Brazilian PhD students were going, so it's kind of warm and damp, and I was like, no, it's cold and damp, and they were just like, we don't understand cold and damp because they don't have it. It's just not an atmospheric condition that they had ever experienced. So trying to explain the humidity from the cooker and the coldness outside and single glazed aluminium windows and the very specific atmospherics, so that that took about 4 hours, and we just kept coming back to them going, I just don't understand it, you know. And it wasn't one of it was so funny because it was just, and it was important for the atmosphere and the tone of the poem. And I think it's probably not something we've talked about, but I think that the biggest challenge in translation is often tone. And I think you were talking about how your kind of American rap had become this beautiful musical experience. And I think sometimes that's the thing that's so hard to pinpoint. And that's the thing that actually, the tone is not carried in the grander concepts of the poem. The tone is carried in the rising damp and the condensation from the cooker and all of these smaller things, these little details that seem completely irrelevant, but actually when it comes to this kind of cultural barrier, you know, if you don't have that, if you can't see the kind of slightly uncomfortable atmosphere that this is all taking place in, then it could become a very nostalgic picture when that's not what it is. So I find that fascinating.
It's so interesting. Thank you so much. We can go on just endlessly, but there is the next event coming soon. So I wanted we can take maybe just a couple of questions because we need to. I see already a hand there. Yes, go on, Della.
Say that, for example, I've read some Dickens in Russian translation before I went, when I was young. Then I went, when I was a student, I went to Britain and I lived there most of my life. And when I read Dickens in English there, it was completely different Dickens. And what I'm saying is, having lived in England, it wasn't just a language limitation, whether it was Russian or Georgian that Dickens was translated. It wasn't a matter of translation, it's a matter of
culture,
experience or living experience that I can relate to. And I couldn't relate to English relationships or English reality until I went there and lived there. Then, even if I read that Russian, the same Russian translation of Dickens, I would have read into something else, which was relatable because I've experienced it. That's one comment. And the other thing I wanted to say, in the same kind of line, on the one hand, as an anthropological point of view, listening to you, there are two things that come to mind. Either we agree that there is a universality of human experience, especially emotional experience, right? Not the logical stuff. And so there's a universality, whether it's a love, a hate, whether the experience of loneliness, or whatever, sadness, this. We agree, let's say, that it's universal experience. And on the other hand, you say that the joy, the passion we can express in Irish, also Georgian, considered to be passionate language, hard to convey in English, which can tend to be aligned with national character stereotype, the cold, restrained, and not expressive, etc. If that's what we are saying, that certain languages, subject to the national character of the people they represent and locality, have different expressive mechanisms, right? For example, sorry, I'm just being on and on, but it's a complex thing I'm trying to explain. Then I have to stick up for English. When I read Shakespeare, it is as passionate as anything I've read in any language, and I know a few. So, are we saying that there are certain languages that lack expression or lack mechanisms? Or are we prejudiced?
I think, I want to jump in there on that Shakespeare thing because I do think there is a historical context to all of this. And I would agree with you on Shakespeare, and I think the language of that era in England was wild and passionate and full of invention. And I think that a lot of the Irish poetry that I'm talking about, there was a great heyday of Irish poetry in the 18th and 19th century. As the language was being erased, some of our best literature was being written that had been passed down orally and then was recorded. And this language in this time has a very specific tone. And also, I do believe to a certain extent that, yes, languages are absolutely shaped by historical forces and contexts. Those things shift and change. I think if you try and fit a contemporary Irish poem into the neat envelope of the English lyric, which is not Shakespeare, then you can come up with a little bit of, it doesn't quite fit.
That's not the shortcomings of the language as per se.
No, absolutely. I would agree with you there. Yeah.
Images, for me, I'm extremely imagistic. I actually write with paintings as metaphor for the things that I want to say. But I don't remember language. I don't know. I don't remember language. I just remember the nature of it.
That's how dreams are kind of realized. Yeah. So if we're done, we can conclude. I guess I want to thank you so much, Andriy Lubka, Jessica Traynor, and Nilufar Talibi. Thank you so much. Thank you. და ყველას ძალიან დიდი მადლობა. მადლობთ ხალხოს უყველას. შემდეგ ღონისძიებაზე გეპატიჟებით ძალიან რამდენი წუთში.
5 წუთში დავიწყებთ შეხვედრას რობერტ დანქენის ცხოვრება და პოეზია.
Thank you so much.